the idea that Christians on the left isn't a contradiction in terms, at least at face value, at least in terms of what a hard left ideology would be. The idea that can be embraced within a Christian worldview is really problematic. And I think at the very least, we need to be talking about this as Christians. We need to be having open conversations where we try and bring a Christian mind to this issue. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of About Abortion, joined once again by Tim. Tim, good to have you. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right, Dave. Thank you. Trying to keep warm in the North Yorkshire. It's quite cold up here at the moment, but doing all right. Yeah,
it suddenly got chilly down here. It was like an extended summer until October the 6th or something, and now it's freezing. But it's a beautiful sunny day down here on the East Coast, and today we are taking a deep dive into something a bit different. We are looking into the red roots of abortion, and this is an area which, to be honest, I don't know as much. I don't know as much about this as I would like to, and that's why I've got Tim on. Tim, you've been sort of knee deep in some interesting literature, I think, on this area. Just we'll get into it in earnest later on, but just give us a potted. Where are we going today? What particular era of history are we going to be diving into?
Yeah, well, I think I should say I wouldn't want to call myself an expert by any stretch, but I have read a few books, and a lot of this is stuff where you can read the arguments of the abortion advocates in their own words, which is always very helpful. So we're not putting words into their mouths. So really, I think primarily the first half of the 20th century, certainly obviously prior to 67, which is when the Abortion Act is passed, but really more essentially the first quarter to a third of the 20th century. So sort of turn of the century to the sort of 1920s and 30s. I'd say the 1920s and 30s are really the key era we're going to be looking at. And what are the factors that feed into those who are really pushing for abortion? We're going to find it's not predominantly the sort of man or woman on the street, actually, but it's a handful of kind of committed ideologues, radicals, really.
Fantastic. Well, this is helpful. So what we're looking at today then is really how we came to be where we are, in particular in terms of legislation. People should, I guess, know this if they've been following the podcast, but if you haven't, the Abortion Act was passed in this country in 1967. Prior to that, there was a reasonable number of abortions, essentially for the so-called hard cases, under an act called Rex v. Bourne. Essentially, abortion was allowed for life-saving situations and also in severe, what you might call social situations, cases of rape and so on. So there was a steady but small, relatively, trickle of abortions up until 67, but 67 really opened the floodgates and rapidly brought us to a situation where we had abortion on demand. That is, any pregnancy that is unwanted in the UK up to 24 weeks can be and is ended through the killing of the unborn child. No one is ever denied an abortion up to 24 weeks in this country. That's the situation we're in. And the question is, how did we get there? And it's an important question to ask, because what we're going to learn today is there are, at the human level, and of course we know behind all of this, there is the great enemy of our souls, the one who came to steal, kill, and destroy, the father of lies, who will work through all sorts of means to bring about destruction, to oppose the work of God. And he seems to have an especial interest in opposing and destroying life in the womb, the image of God, perhaps because it especially reminds him of the incarnation and the Lord Jesus, whom he failed to kill in the massacre of the innocents under King Herod. So we're not ignoring the spiritual background to this, but we want to focus on what took place at the level of human agency. And in particular, we're going to be touching on themes of religion and politics, whether there is a Christian take on certain political persuasions. But in particular, we're tracing the relationship between so-called abortion and what we might call, I guess, the hard left, politically speaking. And that's something that, I guess, as we proceed this morning, we're going to hear where that came from in relatively recent history, modern history, and we're going to hear about how it's still going on today. Abortion, sadly, is supported by all the major parties in this country, but it enjoys the most enthusiastic support still from that wing of politics. So, Tim, where do we begin? Can you tell us something about who are the key players here? Are there key individuals or key groups, organizations, which helped to bring abortion into this country legally, and where did they get it from?
Yeah, I mean, we're not gonna focus on the role of the church this pod because if you've done several very good ones on that day. But obviously, we've touched previously on the Church of England's sort of fairly dishonourable involvement and their 1965 report, which lays the foundation, really lays the groundwork for much of the 67 Act, actually, and very profoundly influences the Act sponsor, so the MP David Steele, who called that Church of England document the best summary of the ethics of abortion yet published. And there are a few as well. Sort of, there's always been a few rogue bishops in the Church of England. That number's growing sadly, but there was one very liberal bishop, Bishop of Woolwich, John Robinson, who was very liberal on abortion in the 60s. He, one of his strange suggestions as well that Lady Chatterley's Lover should be kind of required reading for every Christian, so you can get a sense of where he was coming from. So there was some sort of support hierarchically in the Church of England. Nor was that limited to the Anglicans, I should say. There was nonconformists. So the Methodist Lord Soper was a very strong advocate for liberalisation, for example. But really, what we want to focus on, as I say, is some of these other factors, particularly the political and kind of ideological factors. And we should note the role of the Labour government in all of this. So obviously, David Steele himself was a Liberal MP. Then as now, seemingly there was never very many of them. There was about 13 at the time. So he was relying on the support of the majority Labour government at the time to pass this bill. And he kind of knew he could rely on them because the health minister at the time was a man called Kenneth Robinson. And in 61, Kenneth Robinson himself had sort of put through an act not that dissimilar, or bill not that dissimilar to David Steele's, to liberalise abortion law. And writing in The Guardian at the time, a journalist called Michael Frayn. So this bill didn't pass, Robinson's bill didn't pass in 61. But this journalist said that it would have saved women's lives. It would have made the beastly lot of being an unwanted child a little less common. And that the measure was left to founder on the spurious arguments of a minority. So he's talking there of Christian MPs and actually principally Roman Catholic MPs, is a moral failure which in some sense degrades us all. So you can see already this kind of alliance of left-wing politics and press pushing very hard for abortion and also setting it up, ironically, as a moral issue itself. So, of course, every reasonable, right-thinking, compassionate person would be on our side. So that's the sort of, you can see how the landscape is being portrayed really on that side. So the Labour government comes to power, it's sort of 60s, mid 60s, and there's also a man called an MP, Labour MP called Douglas Houghton, who's initially got responsibility for social services in the government, and he's married to a lady called Vera Houghton, and she is chair of the Abortion Law Reform Association, and that's a key group we'll say more about later. But Vera Houghton, she's also vice president of the British Eugenics Society from 64 to 66. Previously has been executive secretary of the International Planned Parenthood Federation. So that's a name we're familiar with in the 50s. So it's very clear where her priorities lie. It's very clear where ideologically she's coming from. But again, what you see is at the highest levels of government, the Labour hierarchy has these very strong links. Sometimes they're informal, but there's very strong links nevertheless with the pro-abortion cause. And as I say, I think David Steele's bill would simply not have passed without massive support of Labour MPs. And that support was very much reflected in the left-wing press, just as it is today.
Thank you. That's helpful, Tim. So in terms of the immediate run-up in the 60s, we've got a Labour government which provided some of the conditions, I suppose, necessary, some influential people. But obviously that's not where it started, is it? It's not just a case of, well, David Steele put it forward. There are a couple of, key people who are sympathetic, and that was it. You mentioned the Abortion Law Reform Association. So tell us a bit more about them, and how far back really does this go?
Yeah.
Is there a key moment when things started building up in earnest in this country?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of just to say as well that so if you'd have asked people, if you'd done a kind of straw poll at the time prior to, I don't think most people on the street were pushing for this massive liberalisation, which the '67 bill brought in. There had been one or two things that had been sort of captured and taken opportunity of, and one of them was, I think we would be remiss not to mention the thalidomide scandal of the early '60s, which of course was an absolute tragedy and led to the births of many children with very severe deformities, often missing limbs and stuff. And so what happened was the pro-abortion support kind of seized on that tragedy and kind of made the point, oh, isn't it an equal tragedy that these babies weren't able to be aborted, that their parents weren't able to kind of end their lives, as this would have been the most compassionate, quote unquote, thing to do. So that certainly is a bit of a trigger that they use, but really there isn't this mass appeal. And in 39, for example, after 2 years, there's a report of the Joint Committee of the Ministry of Health and the Home Office who look into the kind of abortion, the law around abortion, and they reject the demands of ALRA, so the Abortion Law Reform Association. I'll just call them ALRA because it's a bit less of a mouthful, and they really put forward a fairly, argument on fairly Christian grounds, sort of sanctity of life, etc. So the government are not themselves particularly pressing hard prior to this. Doctors are not particularly pressing hard. The medical establishment sort of kind of likes where the position is. They have a degree of control over things. They're seen as the experts. But what we do have is this group called ALRA. And so what they pitch themselves as a reform group, and this is often what happens. I would argue they don't really want reform, because what they're arguing for, as we've said, is not so much reform as abortion on demand. It's complete liberalisation up to 28 weeks, actually. And I think they realise, actually, that if the public knows their end game, they wouldn't be particularly supportive. So often it's all couched in sort of euphemism. It's all very disingenuous, apart from one or two sort of people that they can't basically shut up because they're so extreme in their views. But so if you look at ALRA, it's formed in 1936, so that's a key date. So you think of 1936, you think of a sort of fairly febrile atmosphere, run up to the Second World War, all sorts of things going on in Germany, Nazi Germany at the time. 1936 is a key date. And I would say there's several factors. There's at least three factors, three threads that kind of come together in the formation of the Abortion Law Reform Association. One of which is this desire for greater birth control. So many of the people who form ALRA have been part of something called the Workers' Birth Control Group, as well as something called the Malthusian League. So if you remember any sort of 19th century history, the guy called Thomas Malthus, who was a sort of economist and social theorist, and he was terrified of the idea of overpopulation. And basically his theory was that food supply would never really keep up with population. So if food supply increased, the population would increase to match, and you'd have this constant sort of battle of resources, which would eventually lead to sort of famine and starvation. So there was a real concern for overpopulation. And, you might think, well, that sounds not so dissimilar to what we have today. There was also a campaign for greater access to contraception, and that contraception itself became steadily more available, more, I think, socially acceptable in Britain, certainly in the early part of the first half of the 20th century. So that was a major social change. But what that did is it led often to then abortion advocates presenting abortion as just another form of birth control, which of course is nonsense. Contraception prevents a life from being formed. Abortion ends a life. They're very different things, I think, qualitatively, but they were sort of lumped together. And because I think there was still a little bit of fuzziness in the public's mind about this, they got away with that, I think, for far longer than they should have done. So there's birth control going on, and a sense that perhaps birth control needs to be a factor, and the government should be involving itself in this. Although that's very up and down, because at times and remember this is a period where there's a lot of wars being fought. At times, people then get very worried that the population is going to fall off, and we're not going to have enough people, not going to have enough soldiers. So then it's suddenly, right, forget all that. We need to start having more children. So it's a very sort of pragmatic kind of up and down thing. There is also a very troubling link to eugenics. And again, remember the period here, the 1920s and 1930s. There are ideas floating around where that basically certain ethnic groups, it would often be termed in races, but I don't like that idea. For me, there's only one race, that's the human race. But let's call them ethnic groups. Different ethnic groups are sort of inferior to others, and there are some that are superior. We can all kind of imagine who these people said were the superior groups. And there was this fear that the sort of inferior groups were going to outbreed, this is their language, the more superior groups. And that was a real fear for a lot of these people. And if you look, it's not just Britain, I should say, several European nations at the time have sort of sterilization programs for those deemed sort of unsuitable to be parents. This is, of course, as I say, the climate where the Nazi Party comes to prominence. And Marie Stopes was a very ardent birth control supporter. You know, we should say she wasn't actually in favor of abortion, bizarrely, even though one of the main abortion fighters is named after her. But she's very much into eugenics. She's very much into birth control. And her organization, which gives you a bit of a clue, was called the Society for Constructive Birth Control and Racial Progress. So you draw your own conclusions. And the motto of this organization was babies in the right place. The paper she used to disseminate these ideas, the Birth Control News, carried the slogan, birth control, joyous and deliberate motherhood, a sure light in our racial darkness. So, yeah, an interesting woman by all sounds. And Stopes, she admired Hitler. She even, I think, at one point sent Hitler a bit of her love poetry. She thought he might enjoy. She saw the Jews and many other ethnic groups as a problem. She was against what she termed interracial marriage. And she advocated for the sterilization of again, these are her words, the hopelessly rotten and racially diseased. So you can see the level of extreme language, extreme dehumanization. I think that's important that's going on here. And members of these groups and people who would become really prominent in ALRA, who would co-found ALRA, people like Stella Brown, were equally virulent, often how this was often expressed in Britain at the time, Dave, was in sort of anti-Irish sentiment. So I'm sorry, but that came across really in her works, and it's no surprise. And I think that despite all the left-wing admiration there is for someone like Stopes, groups named after her have sort of sought to distance themselves from her because of these various fairly troubling beliefs. So that's two sort of parts of it. You've got birth control, you've got eugenics, and the third thing I would say is critical to understand is the final contribution is what I'd call a kind of new sexual ethic. Okay, so a sort of a liberalization of sexuality and thought around sex, really. So, and you get all sorts of weird and wonderful groups, well, not so much wonderful, really, coming up at this time. So there's something called the World League for Sexual Reform, which is really a kind of umbrella of all sorts of birth control advocates, proponents of sexual freedom, often feminists, and often pro-abortion advocates as well. And in 1929, that's quite an important date, really. They hold a congress in London. So their big kind of international gathering of all these sorts of people brings together various people, including, really quite wacky characters. So someone like Havelock Ellis, a man called Havelock Ellis, again, a very vehemently anti-Christian guy, a eugenicist. He described himself as a sexologist. He was advocating for the normalization of things like homosexuality, things like transgenderism, as well as the right to elective abortion, so abortion on demand. And on the basis of very faulty science at the time, he really argued that the fetus had no real identity independent of the mother. So again, we might hear these arguments today. So these are the factors, I think, that are important to kind of get our heads around as we see what are the threads that come together in the formation of ALRA, the Abortion Law Reform Association, and what shapes their worldview. So there's a desire for fairly rigorous birth control, often with a desire that the state would kind of take the lead and perhaps intervene in that. There's very much a sympathy with eugenics and some of the eugenic arguments going around. And there's very much a desire for sexual liberalization. And that's often linked with a denigration of the family, of marriage life, and especially I think of motherhood and what was seen as important and for women at the time. So there's some of the things that lead up to ALRA. So why I think that's important is when people buy into sort of pro-choice rhetoric and pro-choice argument, I would say this is very much the worldview, Dave, that they are buying into. All these things are part of the background. It's really important to say.
That's very helpful. And so when we pull back the curtain to see what's really there, what's behind a so-called pro-choice position, we see this confluence, don't we, of things which we can term, broadly speaking, it's hard left politics, isn't it? It's population control. It's also deeply Darwinian, isn't it? This idea of improving the human race, which is of course fundamentally dehumanizing. To apply a Darwinian philosophy to human beings, to talk about controlling the breeding, improving the race, applying the word species to humans and animals interchangeably. There is a direct line here, isn't there? And we haven't got perhaps the space today to talk about Darwin, but I think what I'd like people to think about is the way in which we can be quite complacent, really, with these streams of thought, which continue to this day, and we think they're harmless or irrelevant, or we think even they can be justified biblically, and no damage will be done. But in fact, they are diametrically opposed to a biblical worldview. To speak about human beings in animalistic terms is to deny what Scripture says. To say that we need to control, i.e., reduce birth at a population level, and actually socially engineer or even enforce, that is anti-biblical. Command to go forth and multiply. It's worth mentioning, isn't it? If I'm not mistaken, Malthus was actually an ordained clergyman, wasn't he? So
yeah.
There's this unholy alliance between the church and these hard left politics. And hard left, I think we'll perhaps go on to this, but we might as well say atheistic. I mean, that's really what's at the heart of this. It's godless politics. It's a godless worldview. And actually, there can be no real mixing. Of course, there's going to be overlap on certain conclusions, certain issues, but there is no commonality between an atheistic approach to public life and policy and a Christian one. And yet, to this day, in huge swathes of the church, we entertain these streams, don't we? And particularly the overpopulation one continues to be extremely influential, mixed together with climate hysteria. I actually have stood outside a Christian justice conference seeking to engage people on the issue of the baby genocide. And I literally had a professing Christian say to me, well, with the way the climate is, the clock's ticking. That's our priority here. What's the point in having babies if the planet's not going to last much longer? And they were near enough justifying the killing of babies on the back of the sort of climate alarmism. So and overpopulation kind of mixed in with that. So still to this day, these streams of thought, which are fundamentally atheistic, continue to influence not only our society, but the church as well.
Yeah, and I would say, yeah, it's people are not the problem. It's wrong thinking. It's wrong ideology, and yeah, 100%. And I think once you get away from that idea that humanity is beautiful but broken, so humanity is actually created perfect but then falls, and you kind of don't have that when you think, well, we're just going to steadily improve the human species through all these kind of ideological and political interventions. Well, you look at the 20th century, that's how that worked. It didn't, and it led to a body count in the hundreds of millions. But yeah, so absolutely those factors are part of it. And let's then come to ALRA, and let's kind of really drill down into who ALRA were, who the personalities were. Founded, as I say, in 1936, and I think that it's the leadership or the executive is purely female, so it's limited to women. You got Janet, so people called Janet Chance, Alice Jenkins, Joan Mallison, Stella Brown, as I mentioned. They sort of formed this group in 1936. Over half are members of the Labour Party, so you can see already where the political sort of their political kind of sympathies lie. Another over a fifth have links with the Fabian Society, which is another socialist group. And there are very strong connections with the women's branch of the cooperative movement. So very much a kind of left-wing movement. Here's the interesting thing, Dave, talking about worldview. Nearly 3/4 of this group would describe themselves as atheists or agnostic. So from the outset, it is a group that fundamentally has kind of rejected God. By and large, there may be a handful of sort of liberals in the midst who claim to be Christians, but by and large, this is a group that's rejected God, certainly rejected Christianity. They would see Christianity really as the main obstacle to what they regard as social progress, meaning in this instance, abortion liberalization. By the mid-60s, 1/3 of the members of this group have had at least one abortion, so even before it's sort of fully legal. So it's very much something that's driving them on a personal basis. As I say, a lot of the times they would tone down their rhetoric because I think they realized that some of the extreme arguments they use would actually turn the public off and would not help their cause. But excuse me, there are within this movement people who I would describe as essentially ideological diehards, people like Stella Brown and Janet Chance, who didn't really care what people thought of them or how they came across and were very outspoken. So Brown, in particular, describes herself as a feminist and a communist. She advocates for free love, very extreme in her views. She argues for a moral right to abortion, okay, as an absolute right up to the viability of the child. So that was then reckoned to be 28 weeks. She was against any kind of restrictions within this period because she said, our bodies are our own, for our bodies are our own. So what you begin to see with some of these kind of ideological diehards are some of the slogans which we're very familiar with today, which are kind of, we all know my body, my choice, that kind of thinking. These really originate with this very extreme left-wing, I would say communist, sort of feminist, and very much anti-Christian mindset, okay? So that's the soil which they grow out of. It's deeply anti-Christian, it's kind of sexually libertarian, and it's radically feminist. And Brown is extraordinary because some of her arguments for abortion are essentially, bear in mind, contraception methods, birth control methods are not perhaps what they are today. So some of their arguments for abortion are essentially about abortion being a less cumbersome means of birth control. It doesn't get in the way of the sexual act. That doesn't inhibit sexual pleasure. Okay, so she thinks sex should be pursued without any kind of commitment or consequence, so absolutely kind of no strings attached. And really anything that gets in the way of that is a problem. So if a baby comes along, well, that's a problem you can just get rid of. So she says on another occasion, not abortion, but forced motherhood is the crime. So again, this gives you a little bit of an insight into her thinking. She herself was openly promiscuous. So really just to underline, this is a worldview that's adamantly opposed to kind of Judeo-Christian morality, any kind of moral restraint, actually, and certainly the goodness of the family. So that's Stella Brown. Let me just briefly tell you about Janet Chance, another co-founder. She was similarly hostile. So she had no problem with killing children in the womb in great numbers, but she maintained that religious creeds are intellectual crimes. So the real people who are abusing children are those nasty people who are teaching them Christian values at Sunday school and through Christian education and stuff. So absolutely ideologically driven. And she berated politicians. She was very outspoken, berating politicians who, in her mind, were not moving fast enough for her liking on this liberalization cause, for fear of losing Christian votes for Catholics, Church of England, or whatever. And she was particularly scathing against the Roman Catholic Church. And in fact, there was a liberal politician at the time who was lecturing on divorce law reform. So a lot of these things are kind of very kind of immediate at the time, the 1920s, 1930s. And this guy, Viscount Buckmaster, was lecturing on divorce law reform, and he had a number of questions from the audience, which were obviously kind of coming from a Catholic perspective, and he just point blank refuses to answer them, refuses to engage. But what I think is interesting about that is already you see this kind of, well, any kind of perspective we think is difficult, problematic, actually we haven't got good answers to, we're just going to ignore. We're not actually going to engage with it. We're just going to either ignore it, no platform it, cancel it, call it all sorts of nasty things. That's going to be our tactic. So you can see already where this is coming from. And it's really interesting. She sums up the Alra fight. This is how she describes it. not as a medical or legal cause, but as an ethical one. So for her and Stella Brown and people like her, this is absolutely an ethical kind of crusade, you might say. It's an ideological goal that they're pursuing. And they have all sorts of kind of, fairly dubious means of pursuing this. The euphemism comes in a big way. So they often they kind of start talking about termination of pregnancy within this period. So even avoiding abortion, which itself is a euphemism. So they're trying to kind of, on the one hand, they're pushing for the absolute maximum sort of abortion law that they can, but they're also disguising it. They talk a lot about unwanted babies. And one of the books I was reading was saying they kind of perfect the art of carefully worded, pre-tested public opinion polls that they know will create the results that they want in their favor. So there's some very sophisticated, these were educated people, they're very sort of middle class people, educated people who are very subtle in their methods and in how they pursue these goals. So that's something of some of the personalities involved and how they pursue this sort of reform in the UK.
It's quite astonishing, Tim, how contemporary some of those phrases sound today. My body, my choice, forced motherhood, and so on. This is nearly 100 years ago. It's incredible.
Yeah,
and yet, as you say, what this group and the abortion lobby ever since has been very deft at is only releasing to the public what it knows the public will swallow. And we've seen that right up to the present day. So in the 60s, even if you read the parliamentary Hansard for the debate around the 67 Act, none of that kind of language was even coming out then. 30 years later, in the 1960s, in Parliament, there was none of this sexual liberalization chat in Parliament. There was none of this my body, my choice. It was all about, as you say, the thalidomide, compassion. What are we going to do about backstreet abortions? Yeah. And even as recently as the Irish referendum, they were not saying in the sort of public campaigns, we need abortion on demand. It's all about sexual freedom, because they knew they still had to persuade a fading but still present nominal Catholic, somewhat pro-life population. So what do? They wheeled out a story of a woman who died from sepsis or something similar, to do with a miscarriage, nothing even to do with the intentional killing of an innocent child, nothing to do with the abortion law. There was no abortion law at the time in Ireland. And yet they knew that would manipulate ignorant, naive people into supporting their law. But their law wasn't that life-saving support should be given to women with in danger of sepsis or suffering from some medical condition, which is already the case in Ireland. You can already treat, a miscarriage or whatever in Ireland. No, what they actually passed on the back of that media campaign was abortion on demand, up to, I think, 14 weeks or so. On demand for any reason or no reason. It is a cynical campaign of deception that it worked back then and it's still working today. And it's very important that people wake up to this. And we're beginning to work on a campaign to highlight this to wider society, that there is and always has been this huge chasm actually between public opinion and what this very influential but relatively small abortion lobby has been pushing. The wool has been pulled over people's eyes. And I'm not here to claim that the average person on the street is avidly pro-life, but they're certainly not avidly pro the baby genocide in the way that these guys were from the beginning. And yet they've been manipulated through this cynical campaign to only release what is publicly acceptable, but then in the background drafting these bills which allow for really unlimited genocide.
Absolutely. And I think whenever you see abortion reform in the world, it always proceeds on the same basis. They find some extreme case. It's usually rape or incest or something of that nature, a tragic case. But then they make that as if this is the normal. This is what normal abortion looks like, and this is how it all proceeds. And the same thing happened in the early 20th century. You get various show trials with where pro-abortion medics are wheeled out, and there's a tragic case often. Perhaps there was a case where a 14-year-old girl is raped by some soldiers in London, and it's very cynically used to drive forward a certain agenda, which the results are completely go way beyond
Yeah.
this very limited circumstances of the actual case that's used to sort of to set the thing up.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is a textbook kind of tactic that they use and are still using today, really. No, absolutely. So
Just before we
I
proceed,
think
Tim, I wanted just to
yeah.
pick up on a couple of quick things, just to clock for everyone some other elements of this whole political bent. You mentioned quasi censorship, and I think that's another really important thing for us to be on the lookout against. It's something that is at home in hard left politics, whether it's um, hard censorship where people are silenced, even disappeared, so to speak, for challenging the regime, or at the sort of softer level of cultural Marxism, where people are smeared and deplatformed, cancelled, or whatever. It's something that we continue to see to this day, and again, it's deeply un-Christian to try and silence opposition rather than refute opposition. We see Paul at work in the Jewish and Greek world, reasoning and proving from the scriptures, and I'm not necessarily making the case for unlimited free speech. I think that's another interesting conversation we could have another day. The recent stuff with GB News and Lawrence Fox and so on. Of course, certain things, hate speech and so on, incitement to violence. Of course, there are limits, but those limits need to be defined Christianly, according to truth and goodness. But the idea of shutting down any form of opposition is not Christian, and it's something that Christians should be on the lookout against. The other stream I just want to highlight as well for us is you mentioned feminism, and again, a huge topic, but I think Christians today, many Christians, are naively oblivious really to where feminism has come from, what it's made of. Of course, different people mean different things by the term feminism, but we need to start thinking about what it means for a lot of people, where it's come from, what it does, the claims it makes. Because I heard one of the speakers from the Keswick Convention on the main stage this year refer to herself quite in quite an unqualified sense as a feminist, and that's something we need to be very wary of, because whether explicit or implicit, it carries a whole load of ideas which are really antithetical to God's creation of man and woman, and well, here we see some of the fruit of that thinking. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of About Abortion. I hope you're appreciating these podcasts, and if you are, can I ask for your help in getting these vital messages to more people? We're delighted that we can get these to people free of charge, but that's not free for us to produce. It costs something like £300 to £400 a month to get these podcasts produced. And I wonder if you could help us, partner with us financially. Many of us will have an Amazon Prime subscription or some kind of streaming platform to the tune of £6, £7, £8 a month. I wonder if you consider, as it were, taking out a subscription with us. If you could donate, say, £8 a month, if we had about 40 people donating around £8 a month, just £8 a month, that would help us to continue to do these podcasts free of charge for anyone who wants to listen in. And this is the only podcast specifically about abortion in the UK. It's the greatest injustice, not only of our time, but in all history. Would you help us to bring these life-saving messages to more people? And don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe. Do send this in particular to your church leaders and anyone else you think might be interested. Thank you so much for your support, and I'll let you get back to the episode now.
No, absolutely. And of course, there are, there are certain things that you can say were noble campaigns. For example, women's suffrage, which I think we'd all kind of agree was a good thing. But then, yeah, a lot of the underlying motives and factors were not helpful. And I think also the fruits of it, are women today happier, more satisfied than they were 100 years ago? I think that's a mute. It's a debatable question, isn't it? But yeah, that's a whole of it. There's interesting stuff there, which we'll have to kind of come back to at some point. But yeah, going back to Alra, so I think what we have to realize is at the time, this is early 20th century, even in a very nominal way, and even with some of these horrible things going on in sort of Nazi Germany, there is a nominal kind of Christian worldview that is sort of still prevalent, and sort of the view of the unborn child would roughly be shaped on the sort of Judeo-Christian values and the sanctity of life. So there's very little. So you're looking around the West, Western Europe, America. There's very little template for ALRA to kind of look to inspire them. Where are they going to get this? Where are they going to see their reformed abortion kind of program rolled out? Well, they have a very clear template, and that is in the Soviet Union. And what I want to just do now for sort of 5 to 10 minutes is explain the role of the Soviet Union and their abortion policy in sort of inspiring ALRA and giving them a kind of clear model to follow. So we've talked a little about feminism, we've talked about anti-Christian sentiment generally, and pervasive influence of left-wing politics. And here we really see that left-wing element most clearly. So the Soviet Union, created in sort of 1922, it's called something slightly different before that, but in this manifestation in 1920, the Soviet Union, or its sort of predecessor, is the first nation in Europe, if I can kind of include Russia and Europe for a moment, to legalize abortion. So 1920, the sort of forerunner of the Soviet Union, legalizes abortion. And this is kind of a real, this is a sort of, there's no precedent for this. It's completely, completely out of sync with any other European country. Before this, in the modern period, you have to go back to the short-lived and fairly bloody Paris Commune of 1871. So a kind of a failed and short-lived communist experiment, which includes provision for abortion alongside mass executions of the clergy. I think they actually killed the Archbishop of Paris during the few days they're in charge. So a kind of revolutionary violence. You have to go back to that. There's no precedent prior to 1920 when the Soviets legalized abortion. And that's really important because what it tells us that from its inception, communism, this kind of vision of the hard left and their view of society and how they want to control everything within society, there is no space, there is no sense of the sanctity of life. Again, in complete contrast with the kind of Judeo-Christian worldview. And I don't think it's a surprise that it's the Soviet Union, this communist nation, that's the first to break with this kind of accepted millennia-old consensus, really. Because there simply isn't, the human being does not have that inherent value within communism that it does in Christianity, still less are they made in the image of God. It's very pragmatic. The value of a human being really is purely in what they can contribute to the state. So human worth is to be honest, Dave, roughly akin to sacks of coal or potatoes. So if you want your female workforce to work like slaves and be undistracted by childcare as they sort of forge this communist utopia, which is what the Soviets do, then you mandate abortion on demand. That's what happens in 1920. And the decree of this 1920, the results of this 1920 decree, by the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, is really the deaths of around 260 million unborn children, which are statistics that you just can't really comprehend. They're that vast. But just to look at this in a little bit more detail. So in 1922, there's about 35,000 births and just under 8,000 abortions. It's roughly 18% of pregnancies that are terminated, less than 1 in 5. By 1929, so in just 7 years, this has risen to over 51,000 births, but over 82,000 abortions. So nearer to 62% of pregnancies are being terminated. So more babies are being killed than are being allowed to be born. This is more than 3 in 5 pregnancies are ending in abortion. So you have this almost a flick of a switch in 1920, and suddenly this huge number of abortions under the pressure of the communist state. And this places huge strain on the medical system. In fact, there begins to be pushback in the first few years, because to perform that number of abortions is to stretch, the medical system to breaking point. And as the 1920s wear on in the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, there's genuine fears again of population collapse, because you can't kill that number of children and expect your population to grow in the same way. And of course, the Soviets are worried about what that's going to do to the agricultural workforce, who's going to man the factories. And so there's a equally sudden change of tack. And abortion is now discouraged, especially in first pregnancies. And so in the very places where these abortions are performed, you have posters up, discouraging you to have an abortion, or saying, well, make this one your last. And there's even fetuses from early pregnancy displayed to indicate that, the marvel of fetal development, and this is what you're doing really in an abortion. So
Yes.
it's this crazy, crazy system. And there begins to be medical data released as the 1920s and 1930s go on in the Soviet Union, suggesting that actually this isn't just a simple operation. There are serious side effects, of course, psychologically, emotionally, but also around physical things, sterility, ectopic pregnancies, and the like. And so finally, what happens in 1936, so a decade and a half after this law is passed, ironically, the year that ALRA is formed in the UK, the Soviet Union backtracks on this legalization of abortion and basically forbids it with, a small number of caveats. And they quote, they sort of this reversal of their legislation is to target light-hearted attitudes towards the family and family obligations. That's the official wording. And there's a raft of other kind of pro-family measures to support this decree. But as we say, this is kind of it's purely pragmatism. The population, hence the workforce, hence the army, has taken a hit, and the abortion policy is directly responsible. So they kind of backtrack. But when the population rebounds, so as I say, there's no real concern for human worth. There's no real concern about the value of the unborn child. It's purely, well, our population is not increasing as we want. And when the population begins to rebound after World War II in the 1950s, the abortion law is again loosened, and that decree, that counter decree, if you like, is rescinded in 1955. And again, Dave, the effects are just staggering. So figures for abortion in the 1950s and the 1960s in the Soviet Union are terrifying. Again, we see more babies actually aborted than born alive. And this peaks in 1965, where within the whole Soviet Union, so bear in mind, this is more than Russia, it's all the kind of Central Asian republics that we now have. You take the whole of the Soviet Union, 1965, there's an estimated over 8.5 million abortions happening there. So for every 100 live births, nearly 170 babies are being killed, which, I mean, you just cannot comprehend the scale, the horror of these figures. And it does begin to sort of reduce. So if you look at 2020 in Russia, which, as I say, doesn't represent the totality of the Soviet Union, the percentage of abortions has decreased to 27.8%, but that's still massive. And it still equates to 450,000 lives lost. But as I say, it's hard to get our heads around these figures. But what I really want to kind of impress upon the people listening or watching to this is that what is the context for this? It's the communist ideology. And even today in China, which comes out of that same sort of communist mentality, for years and years, they had their one-child policy, which eventually was rescinded again. So the same fears of population collapse. But of course, what that did in the meantime was led to a huge imbalance in the number of boys and girls being born, because if you could only have one child in the traditional Chinese society, most families wanted boys, so they would be far more willing to abort baby girls than baby boys. So you got, to the scale of millions more boys than girls, which has led to sort of huge numbers of Chinese men in later life not being able to find marriage partners, all the rest of it. But if you look at that Chinese one-child policy era, which lasted for about 35 years, one conservative figure puts it at 336 million abortions. Another figure is closer to 400 million. So it's vast. And even today in China, there's still a very high rate of abortion, even higher than in Russia. Over 42.7% of conceptions result in abortion in 2020, which equates to around 9 million children. So what's that? More than the population of London every single year, or in 2020. And just as we bring this back to how this affected the UK, just a little aside, might remember 2015, 8 years ago, there was a debate in Parliament. It was Prime Minister's question times, and it just so happened that the shadow finance minister John McDonnell, of course, who was a very much a representative of this hard left ideology within Labour. He actually brandished a copy of Mao's Little Red Book in the House of Commons, and I think he was trying to be tongue in cheek. I think he was trying to make a joke, but just think about that and the number of people killed in Maoist China, the number of babies aborted, and here you have a UK politician sort of legitimizing that regime, almost siding with it in a way, and saying this is okay, this is and you just think, wow, we've got to have our eyes open, guys. We've got to really understand who these people are and what sort of society they envisage for us. As I say, it's almost impossible to get our heads around these figures. But let's come back to what led up to abortion being legalized in the UK, and the crucial movement, which I suggest is ALRA, so the Abortion Law Reform Association. And again, within ALRA, within meetings of the World League for Sexual Reform, whenever abortion comes up, the model, the template that is held up is the Soviet Union. So this country that produces 260 million aborted babies in whatever it is, 70 years. This is the model, this is the template that they aspire to. And Stella Brown, who I've said is particularly extreme in her views, she co-founds ALRA. She admires the Soviet Union. She's a communist, as I say, but she also admires them particularly for their abortion policy. When the Soviet Union backtracks on their abortion policy, when they realize this is a disaster, we're gonna kill all our population. When they backtrack on this, Stella Brown is so infuriated with them, she cuts her ties with the UK Communist Party. So the kind of statistics, the policies, the ideology that we find so horrifying when we read about the Soviet Union, when we think about China into the modern period, the things we find so horrifying are what absolutely 100% inspires and drives ALRA. Okay, as I say, they are the principal force pushing for abortion in the UK throughout the 20th century up to 67, and in fact beyond 67. They immediately begin campaigning for kind of abortion clinics after that point. So this is the reality. This is the history. This is the ideological kind of crucible in which these things came about, Dave. And I think it's imperative that we understand that. And if any Christians are kind of tempted to be supportive of abortion or be supportive of the pro-choice movement more generally, they need to understand what it is they're getting on board with when they do so.
And conversely, of course, any Christian who wishes to stand for life, as we all should, needs to understand that playing around with these hard left politics is no trivial thing. What we're saying here is that the likes of David Steele and the Church of England in the 1960s and the MPs who ushered this through were little more than useful idiots, frankly, compared to this incredibly strategic, focused, persistent, small but highly influential group who are essentially taking their inspiration from a genocidal Russian Soviet regime, which we already think about the 20th century as a century of bloodshed with the two great wars, but actually the figures, the numbers of babies killed, really is many times that, isn't it? It's many times the adult deaths and otherwise born essentially deaths from the two great wars. They pale in comparison with these huge figures. I mean, 260 million. It's impossible to compute, but right up to the present day, as you say, with China, it carries on. This is a product of the hard left. Now, I want to talk just briefly, Tim, about Christians in politics, or rather Christianity in politics, because there is, I think, something of a, I don't know what to call it. It's there's a convention in most churches in the UK today that you don't pronounce on politics. You preach the gospel, you teach the Bible, but you would never dream of trying to steer people in the direction of one political party or another. And the implication is almost that, well, there is no Christian answer to things like hard left politics. Some Christians may support that. Some Christians may go the other way. It's almost akin to saying, well, just because you're Christian doesn't mean I should tell you which football team to support. That's not a religious question. It's not a moral question. It's just a question of preference, really. That's what we communicate, I think, by our silence. So can you tell us a bit about, with the Communist Party, for example, uh, well, looking back at the Soviet, perhaps the Soviet Union, um, what were their religious beliefs, and how did that affect their, for example, abortion policy? Um, or to put it another way, is it just neither here nor there what people think about God and politics, God and Christianity? Yeah, their politics just this is a different category.
No, I think it's absolutely connected. Well, of course, classically, the communists, the Soviets, these movements were profoundly atheistic. They wanted to get rid of God. They saw God as a, whether you go back to Karl Marx, who sort of talks of religion as the opium of the people, that sort of religion keeps populations sort of placid and submissive and happy with their lot in life, which I think you can disagree, but it's an argument of sorts. But when the thing comes to power, how that expresses itself is in just an absolute intolerance of any other worldview that challenges the party. You know, and so of course in Russia, the main expression of religion, of Christianity, is the Orthodox Church, and that is kind of systematically dismantled. So, of course, priests, monks killed. It's often incredibly bloody, and the church is just completely crushed within society, really, and ridiculed, shut down. Huge numbers of as I say, martyrs. And people are taken off as political prisoners to the gulags and stuff, and that continues right throughout the 20th century. And you see that, of course, across the not just in Soviet Russia, but of course across Europe, wherever the Iron Curtain is, really, you see Christianity sort of attacked and its role in public life dismantled and reduced. And it's and of course China as well. You see the Chinese. Mao has all these kind of moments where he decides to there's too many rogue elements, too many foreign elements within Chinese society that they need curbing. They need there needs to be some more bloodshed. And that's bigger than Christianity, but certainly Christianity is caught up in that thing that's seen as kind of foreign and other and as a threat to the Chinese communist worldview, the party. And so what happens for example, in China is you get Christianity that's sort of legitimated by the state. So certain churches are given the kind of communist government seal of approval, and they're allowed to operate. But of course, they're massively compromising what they teach. And the Chinese government in recent years has gone a bit down that road again and has tried to do things like censoring the Bible. And I think the Chinese government would rather have Bibles not printed with the Book of Revelation, for example. All sorts of crazy things like this. So yeah, there is actually no real religious freedom in these countries. Whether it's the Soviet Union, whether it's communist China, whether it's any of the other countries in Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe or Cuba or wherever that had the communist influence, religion is not tolerated. And the other thing is, Dave, he's starting from a completely different anthropology. Yeah, so I think they genuinely believe human beings can be perfected given the right socioeconomic conditions and stuff. And so the factor of original sin is kind of written out of the script, and you then try and engineer and sort of socially and politically engineer this kind of utopia. So of course, for communists, there's no world beyond this. There's no sort of new heavens and new earth. We have to create the best thing we have here and now, and we're going to do this with whatever means we can. If that means telling people how many babies they can have, if that means killing babies once they're conceived, then so be it. The state and its ideology comes first. God is a distraction from that, or he's opposed to it. So, yeah.
So that's pretty significant, because actually the hard left worldview or ideology is actually nothing short of a false gospel. If it is promoting this promise of a utopia here on earth, if it shows no regard for eternity, if it doesn't consider human beings as made in the image of God, well, it doesn't even know what human beings are. So how's it going to know what's what's
Sure.
good for them. And so again, I'm not saying it's always easy to know which way to vote. Some of it is localized. Some of it does depend a bit on your local MP, etc. But the idea that Christians on the left isn't a contradiction in terms, at least at face value, at least in terms of what a hard left ideology would be. The idea that that can be embraced within a Christian worldview is really problematic. And I think at the very least, we need to be talking about this as Christians. We need to be having open conversations where we try and bring a Christian mind to this issue. Because the reality is that the purest expression of hard left politics, which we've talked about in this episode, is explicitly rooted in atheism. It's anti-Christian. It expresses hatred for human beings as individuals made in the image of God. It shows no regard for human value. It seeks the destruction of the family. It treats people as units. And this is the kind of web of values that defines the hard left, but this web continues to catch people in it today. And just as we got our abortion policy from Russia, indirectly, to this very day, we continue to import policies, ideas, values, movements from essentially a hard left atheistic ideology. We've seen it in BLM, Black Lives Matter, cultural Marxist movements that explicitly are pushing for the destruction of the family, deny man as made in God's image, male and female. We recently, of course, imported our lockdown policy from China. That was inspired by looking at what totalitarian communist states could do abroad, and well, let's have a go here. But we're now in a situation where we actually don't have any major party that represents anything close really to Christian values, Christian worldview. The so-called Conservative Party has in fact adopted a really good chunk of all that we've talked about today. Loads of it, loads of those values, loads of those attitudes towards the state, the individual, the family, and so on. Not as ferociously, perhaps, as the Labour Party. And it's worth people knowing that at least the last election, it was part of the Labour Party's manifesto to have abortion up till birth on demand. That was actually in the manifesto. But again, they do this sneakily. They didn't wear that on the front so that everyone could see it. In fact, I was standing in the last election. I spoke to my Labour counterpart, and she didn't even know. She denied that it was the case. I had to show her in her own manifesto that they were pushing for abortion on demand up to birth because she didn't believe it, and she herself would not have supported that. And yet this is how they operate. They operate under cover of darkness. Literally, the number of abortion votes that have taken place in the middle of the night with just a fraction of the members of parliament there, the way these bills are drafted, the huge chasm between the likes of the Abortion Law Reform Association and public opinion. This is how it has been for the last 100 years. It's worth just mentioning, Tim, I think, as we close, perhaps, Abortion Law Reform Association continues to exist to this day, doesn't it? It's changed its name. It's called Abortion Rights now. But this organization has continued intact for close to 100 years. And I experienced that as a personal rebuke at a number of levels. The pro-life movement to this day in this country, by comparison, is amateurish. I'm talking about myself here. Amateurish, fragmented, not strategic, short-sighted. And when we compare ourselves to this single organization that has brought about huge change in their favor, so to speak, we really need to pray and work for we need to be reformed. We as a movement need to become far more clear thinking. We need to look further ahead. We need to be strategic. We need to be persistent. And of course, when I talk about ourselves, us, we is the church. The pro-life movement should include the church. It should be obvious, it should be part and parcel. Who else is there to shine the light, to be salt in our society, to speak truth, to declare what human beings really are, and to stand for righteousness and justice? No one else can really do that. And the vast majority of the church has acted as though this is an opt-in thing. You know, if you happen to be interested in politics, if you happen to have a passion for this subject, well, all strength to you. But the rest of us is just going to carry on with church as usual. It's just not acceptable. This has happened on our watch. In fact, it's happened with our support. The 1960s, not just the Church of England, but more or less all churches outside the Roman Catholic Church gave, in some cases, quite enthusiastic support to this. And to this day, we have not really reversed our non-existent or negative stand. And so really, as we look at all of this, we need to wake up, I think, to the important and necessary connection that there is between our Christian convictions and politics and policy. And frankly, we need to be as devoted to saving babies as these guys have been to killing them.
Yeah.
Well,
absolutely.
Tim, I think we've, unless you've got any other final thoughts you want to share, I think we've probably timed out there.
I think that's really a good place to end on, as an encouragement, but also a bit of a conviction for us as Christians, as God's people in the UK today.
Great. Well, Tim, thank you so much for educating us today. It's been a riveting ride through the well, quite troubling in most cases, roots of where we're at today. So thank you for your work on that, and thank you all for listening in. Please do share this, particularly with church leaders, and we'll see you next week. God bless.